Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson on module A225. Ambition and Anxiety. 1789 to 1840, edited by page 330. Unit 7, the British Isle and the Atlantic World. Hayward's intervention seems likely to have shaped the nature of a renewed campaign because she called for a resumption of the boycott of slave produce goods. And this time, many campaigners included cotton in their boycott. In the 1790s, the leaders of the abolition movement sought to rein in a public campaign at times to avoid frightening politicians who had before their eyes the spectacles of the French Revolution and Saint Domingue, where there had been a slave revolt against the French authorities in 1791 that led to the formation of the Republic of Haiti. But the renewed campaign was less under control of its leaders. Holcomb, 2004. Slave owners and compensation. In his conclusion to the price of emancipation 2010, Draper acknowledges that, although he has shown that the slave ownership was more widespread than previously understood in the metropolitan Britain, page 272, and despite it being surprisingly common within sections of the elites. And despite it being surprisingly common with sections of the elites, it was not a mass activity, even among the groups most associated with slave owning. The landed gentry and the large scales rentiers. Slave owners were very much a minority, representing between 5 and 10% of the relevant population. Draper further argues that the question of compensation was a feature throughout the renewed campaign in the 1820s and 1830s. Very few anti abolitionists argued in favour of slavery, and indeed, most argued that they favoured some form of gradual emancipation. They argued against immediate abolition on grounds of humanity and the likely effects on Britain's economy and international situation. It could be considered then that from the late 1820s, most slave owners knew that the game was up, and all they could hope for was as long a delay and much compensation as possible. First, have a close look at the cartoon in figure 7.5. You might want to use the version on this module website, which allows you to zoom in. Next, turn to reading 7.5. Richard Osler, Slavery in Yorkshire, 16th October 1830. Located at the end unit, this brief extract from a letter to the Leeds Mercury newspaper. What political point are the producers of these sources trying to make? What do you think is their main motive? The anti slavery campaigner in the middle of the cartoon in figure 7.5 is highlighting the lack of rights enjoyed by Africans in comparison with people in Britain. But the words attributed to the African slaves and the British working class family suggest that it is the British worker who is the real slave, in danger of starvation, unless he works like a beast and depends on charity, while the slaves are better dressed and better fed and can afford a comfortable family life. Oster does not deny the iniquities of slavery, but makes a similar point with regard to the condition of poor, and he also has a familiar target with regard to the anti slavery movement. Osler appears to be angered by the apparent lack of concern shows by religious supporters of abolition for the poor, and unfortunate on their own doorstep, if we focused just on the sarcasm. In, intended in words of the campaigner and on the words of the British family in figure 7.5, we might suggest that the motive in the cartoon is also to encourage those sympathetic to slaves to include the working class of Britain in their thoughts and campaigns. But the fact that the cartoon portrays slaves as enjoyed a happy life and the Caribbean scene has the word freedom underneath, it suggests that this might not be a case and that this particular cartoon is not motivated by sympathy for all unfortunates, but by anti abolition sentiments. Figure 7.5 and reading 7.5 illustrates two related strands of thought in opposition to abolition. Osler has no sympathy for slavery, but little interest in it either. He appears to consider abolition to be a distraction from the real problem, that of the working classes in the UK. You looked at the issue of living conditions in Unit 3. The Yorkshire MP referred by Ulster is Wilberforce, who campaigned for the temperance movement and moral reform, as well as for abolition. The anti-abolitionists generally aimed for their campaign directly at the political class in Parliament, more than at the public, but aware that the public were unsympathetic to them as individuals, and alarmed that this might undermine their cause in Parliament. Those with slave aimed interests tried to deflect criticism by encouraging people to look at injustice and poverty closer to home. So they used the language of wage slavery. Hayrick was fiercely opposed to compensation on principle, while others believed it was a price worth paying to secure as smooth a passage as possible for emancipation. Some abolitionists, such as Adam Hodgson, 1788-1862, considered compensation morally justified the grounds that it would be robbery, under the grab of mercy, to compel one class of individuals to atone for injustice of the nation, quoted in Draper 2010. The emancipation measure allowed not only for the compensation but also for a period of apprenticeship, under which the former slaves would be bound to continue working for estates and their erstwhile owners for a period initially set at 12 years. As Draper reports, it was an apprenticeship clause that gained most attention and agitation for abolitionists such as Thomas Fowle Buxton, 1786-1845, the MP who had taken over the parliamentary role from Wilberforce. The terms of compensation and apprenticeships were the subject of negotiation between the government and the representatives of the major Caribbean slave owners. The sum to be paid was not initially to be compensation, but a loan to tide them over the period of increased expenses and diminished profits that would result from the end of slavery. Though this was probably always unrealistic, and the government seems to have hinted early on that it could be a grant. The sum originally proposed was 15 million, but 20 million was settled on, probably because that was a sum the planters would accept. Draper 2010. Buxton managed to get the period of apprenticeship reduced for 12 years to 6, but he was unable to get the provisions struck out together, as he fervently wished, although in the event these apprenticeships did not end earlier. In his view, apprenticeships meant that the slaves were themselves paying for their own emancipation. Draper 2010 concludes that compensation for slave property was consistent with the common sense of property rights, as opponents of compensation recognised emancipation was based on the principle that property in people was wrong. But compensation officially recognised that it had hitherto been treated as legally right. Ultimately, though, the fact of compensation and the amount of compensation probably owed as much as pragmatism as to the principles about property. Compensation outrage. Some at the time has outraged many since, but it was necessary at the time if slavery in the British Empire was to be ended. In the conclusion of things, not all of the economy of the British Isles depended on links across the Atlantic in the period 1789 to 1840, and nor was all political attention focused on Atlantic issues such as slavery and abolition. In this period, after all, the British Isles fought a very significant European war and also expanded colonial interest in Asia. Australia was increasingly populated with immigrants from Britain and Ireland, and shortly after 1840, New Zealand would be claimed and colonised by the United Kingdom too. But in section 7.1, I propose that thinking Atlantically is essential if we are to gain a full understanding of the British Isles in this period. I hope that this unit as a whole supported that proposal of section 7.2. It looked at the cultural connections that survived the gaining of independence by 13 of Britain's colonies to become the USA. The Americas continued to be influenced by the British Isles, but the British Isles were also influenced by the Atlantic connections. The economic links between the British Isles and the Atlantic world may not have been the sole driver of industrialisation, But without those Atlantic connection to British economy and therefore the material and social landscape of the British Isle would have a very different. The legacy of the Atlantic slavery discussed in section 7.3 are numerous and global, but the new form of public campaigning that emerged with the abolition movement would resonate through the rest of the 19th century and beyond, and would have links to other movements that you have looked at in earlier units and will look at in the units to come. And lastly, the emancipation of slaves and the compensation paid to slave owners covered in section 7.4 left cultural, economic, political, and social legacies that continue to this day. To understand the British Isle, both historical and contemporary terms, we have also have to understand their place in the Atlantic world.